Welcome to the Women Inspire Aspire podcast. In this episode, I talk to Annapoorna Premkumar about mental health and many other things. Hi Annapoorna, thanks for accepting my invite to appear in the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's a great opportunity and it's a great thing that you've been doing with the podcast. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Could you please go ahead and tell a bit about yourself, what you do, etc.?
Yes. So by training, I'm a scientist. I've recently finished a PhD in neurobiology, where I worked on understanding the biological pathways that are involved in depression. As of now, I've moved away from active research, and I'm currently working with a not-for-profit organization called Blockchain for Impact, which works towards funding biomedical research. So my role in the company is to make sure that the existing relationships that the organization has formed with research organizations and institutes, to make sure that these relationships last longer, and also deciding on further strategies for the company, on what kind of areas we can fund and what would lead to maximum impact for the society. So the reason this is important is there are several players in the field who do fund research. Primarily in India, it is the government that funds research. And a lot of research in biology, in biomedical sciences, that have to benefit society ultimately, lead to products in the market. Such kind of research are necessarily high risk and high reward. And there are not many private players who fund this kind of research. So a philanthropic organization that does this is unique in its sense. And that is one of the reasons that made me want to join this organization.
Great. Let's talk about this depression part a bit because you have been doing the research a lot in this area. Can you tell us more about your research on depression and some of the details, if it is not confidential, of course?
Sure. So, as part of my PhD, I was working on understanding the biology of depression. So, depression, the way it is represented in popular culture, in the media, is such that some people understand that it's an actual condition that needs intervention, while some people think that it is just something in the head, something that's not real. But the truth of the matter is, it is something in your head. There is actual biological basis for depression. There are biological pathways and circuitry in the brain that get altered in depression, and there are ways to show how these get altered. However, despite so many years of research, like scientists, doctors, clinicians have been trying to understand depression and other similar conditions for many years now. And in recent times, with advancements in biotechnology and biomedical sciences, people have the tools to look at the brain and see what changes are happening. And despite all this, in the past 50 years, there have been no new medications for depression. The antidepressants that a person will get prescribed today are the same ones that were being prescribed 30, 40 years ago. Why is this? It's because we still don't entirely understand the cellular and molecular biology of depression. There are intricate things that happen in the brain when there is depression, and those are still very much in the dark. So there are several researchers across the globe who are trying to figure things out and get a step closer to understanding depression better so that we can one day treat it better. So my work was also along these lines. So to understand what's happening at the level of the cells or inside the cells, it requires researchers to work with the brain tissue. Now, for obvious reasons, doing this with human samples is challenging because the only kind of human samples you will have access to are post-mortem samples in this case. And those are very hard to come by. And there are also a lot of ethical clearances that are needed to work with such samples. So as a first step, a lot of researchers work with animal models. Animal models can be, so conditions like depression and other human conditions can be modeled in animals. In my case, I was working with mice. Now, it might seem odd that how can a condition like depression be studied in mice? Mice are simple creatures. They have very simple things to do in life. They just eat, sleep, and survive. They don't have bigger agendas like humans do, like making money or having a motivation to life or having bigger ideas. That That is partly true. Yes, mice are not as cognitively advanced as humans are. But the basic features of depression, which are an inability to feel pleasure or happiness, something that is clinically called as anhedonia and is a classic symptom of depression, and not wanting to socialize, a lack of motivation to live itself, which happens in extreme cases of depression. These things are observed in mice as well. So, a tenet of my study was associating the link between depression and chronic stress. So, like I said, a lot of things about depression are not known, but one thing that is definitely well established is its association with psychological stress. So, years of research and observation has told people for sure that long term stress or events that are extremely stressful or extremely traumatic can induce depression or can make a person more susceptible to depression and other similar conditions. And this is true for mice as well. So, in my study, we essentially would stress mice by various methods. And then we used to check the behavior of the mice. So, there are standard behavior tests which test the motivation of the mice, whether or not they want to interact with other mice, whether or not they prefer to drink sugar water over regular water. These kind of tests are used to understand whether the mice have the ability to feel pleasure and happiness. And when this ability to feel pleasure goes down, that's when we know that the mice have developed depression like condition. So after we did this, we used to collect the brain sample from the mice and look at things changing at the tissue level, at the cell level, and also within the cells. So this is overall larger picture of what I did. And specifically, I was looking at factors that get modified in response to stress. So I'm sure many people would have heard of the DNA or our genes, and people generally understand that genes are very important to who you are. Genes define your biology. Genes are what you inherit from your parents. All that is true. But your genes or your DNA are just a blueprint for the creation of you. To execute the blueprint, there are several other factors, several other regulators which are involved inside each cell in your body. So here's a point. So each and every cell in a human body has the same DNA, has the exact identical DNA. But the cells in your brain and the cells in your liver do not look or function the same. Why is that? The DNA is the same, so ideally they should do the same things, but they don't. How is it that the same DNA leads to not to several different looking cells and several different looking tissues and organs? So this happens because not everything in the DNA leads to things. It's essentially the like if I give two engineers a blueprint for the same blueprint for a house, and I tell them that you have the creative freedom to make it however you want, the result is not going to be the same. The engineers are going to use their own ideas, modify things, use some things, not use some things from the blueprint. And this is exactly how DNA gets executed in different cells in your body. And these factors that are involved in the execution or the functioning of the DNA, some of these factors are called as epigenetic. So genetic is when things have to deal with the DNA, the sequence of the DNA, the exact chemistry of the DNA. Epigenetics are factors which are around the DNA. So nothing in the DNA chemically gets changed, or rather nothing in the sequence of the DNA gets changed. But still, what comes out of the DNA is modified by these epigenetic factors, and these are what I was working with. The reason being, these epigenetic factors, their levels and how they function, that can get modified by environmental cues. So, stress being a very strong environmental cue has direct impact on epigenetic factors in the brain, which eventually affects how genes in the brain function and eventually affects how the brain itself functions. So, not just in conditions like depression, but several other neurological conditions and several conditions relating to different organs in the body. All of them have been associated with epigenetic factors, and several researchers are working towards piecing them out and figuring them out. And maybe someday they will act as targets for drug and better treatment of these diseases. So yeah, that's like a longish gist of my PhD work.
It's a fantastic description of your work. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have a layman question. You already know that stress is a factor and it's a major factor. So, what is it that you are trying to prove out of this research? Are you trying to find out what medicines can be given for addressing the stress factors, or what is it that you are concluding from your research?
Great question. So you actually hit the bullseye. That's exactly what the overarching goal of the research was, to identify possible medications or possible targets for medications that could be used in stress induced depression cases. To give a very brief of what new my study found was, so I mentioned that I was working with epigenetic factors. So, as part of my study, we were working on a new protein in the brain that happens to be an epigenetic modifier. So nothing was known about this protein when I started working with it. The only understanding was that it exists, it possibly exists, and it possibly has some function. So it was not characterized. So through my study, I got to know that yes, this new protein indeed has a function as an epigenetic modifier in the brain, and it gets regulated in depression. So, what I found in the mouse model is that when the mouse was given long term stress, the levels of this protein in the brain were getting modified. So, that was interesting. That gave us an indication that if it is responding to stress and its levels are changed in depression like conditions, could it have a direct function in depression? So to find out that this is indeed the case, so we have methods of modifying the levels of proteins and genes in different systems. So tools including genetic modifications and several others. I won't go into the details of that, but using one such method, we modified the levels of this protein in the brain of the mouse without giving any stress. So we did some intervention which changed the levels of this protein in the brain of the mouse, but there was no overt stress involved. And following this, when we checked the behavior of the mice, they showed depression like conditions, despite there being no stress ever. So this was an interesting observation. So this told us that just changing the levels of this protein in the brain is making the mice develop depression-like conditions. So this essentially means that this protein, let's say, so even though mice and humans are very different visibly, our DNA is still very alike. 95% is the similarity between the DNA. 90% is the similarity between the DNA of a mouse and a human. So, if humans also have similar protein in their brain, similar epigenetic modifier in the brain, obviously this has to be confirmed and this has to be made sure that in humans also, in depression like conditions, this similar protein gets modified. And if that is indeed the case, it could be targeted as an antidepressant, as a method of antidepressant. So, yes, so that is the overarching goal of any such study.
Okay, so how is this antidepressant that is coming out of your protein research different from the existing antidepressants?
So the existing antidepressants, a lot of them uh, are those. So the first line of antidepressants that are usually given for depression are something called as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. So how these function is they change the level of this neurotransmitter serotonin between your brain cells. So for the longest time, people believed that depression happens because there is a change in neurotransmitter levels in the brain, which is partly true. And that's why some people, about 30% of people who have clinical depression, respond to SSRIs pretty well. They start to get better, and at some point, they are able to do okay without the medication. But there are also the 70% of people who don't respond to SSRIs. For them, few other drugs are used. There is another class of antidepressants called tricyclic antidepressants. They have different modes of action and how they function in the brain. Again, some of them do modulate levels of some neurotransmitters, but none of the existing drugs for depression are directly those that change an epigenetic modifier. Because that line of investigation has never reached the stage that someone made a drug targeting an epigenetic modifier. Even though people have been investigating this angle for the past 2 decades at least, it has never reached that stage that people are sure that okay, if I target this epigenetic factor, it is going to help conditions like depression. That has never happened. So any drug that targets an epigenetic modifier would be novel in the field of depression. In fact, epigenetic factors are currently being considered as potential anti-cancer targets. Clinical trials are in fact going on, but for depression and other neurological conditions, they are still far behind. The research is still at the preliminary and preclinical stages.
Oh, great. Thank you
So
so
yes.
much for that information. One follow-up question. Maybe this is a lost about the technical aspects of your research, but so protein is one epigenetic factor that you mentioned, or there are other epigenetic
Mhm.
factors that are being researched?
Yes. So there are several epigenetic factors. There are. So I said protein because there are several types of proteins that do different functions as epigenetic factors. But there are also some RNAs that work as epigenetic factors. So everyone's heard of DNA, but not many would have heard of RNA. So RNA is a molecule very similar to the DNA, but it is not as how would I put it? It's not as sturdy or it is not as fixed as the DNA. So the DNA in each cell of your body is pretty much like it's constant. It's going to be there from the time you're born till the time someone dies. So the DNA is constantly there. The RNA is not quite like that. The RNA gets actively changed, actively modified. It moves around in the cell. It does a lot of other things. So there are specific RNA molecules which can function as epigenetic factors by affecting how the DNA is executed or how the DNA is read, essentially. So epigenetic factors broadly, you could classify them into proteins and RNA.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all the inputs. It gives me a lot of inspiration and motivation to further study this subject and go through the material that's available and all that. I would also encourage the
Thank
audience to learn more about this and get educated on this aspect. Now, let's move on and talk about your hobbies and interests. What do you do for fun apart from work?
What do I do for fun? Well, I read. Although, yes, I'll admit that since I became an active researcher some years ago, reading for fun took a backseat because I was constantly reading for work. But yes, I do enjoy reading. And I, like most other millennials, I watch movies, I watch series, and I listen to music, and I also write. I, of course, write for work and I write as part of my freelance science communication and such. But I also write for pleasure. I write for myself. I have a personal blog too, where I sometimes post poems and short excerpts of things that happened in my life or travel blogs and things like that. So yeah, that's what I do.
Okay, great. So let's talk about some societal issues that you care about and what do you do about them?
So one thing, obviously, I have to mention this: the stigma against mental health or mental illness that exists in our society. So this became very glaringly obvious to me as someone who was working on depression as part of my PhD. So you would expect that researchers or biologists who study depression understand the condition and understand other mental illnesses and mental health related conditions very well. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Knowing or understanding the biology of depression does not mean that someone understands the social and the psychological aspects of it. And this became very obvious to me as a young researcher because while I was doing background research or background reading in the beginning days of my PhD, I was also mainly focused on the biology aspect of it because that's what I was going to work on. But whenever I would come across literature on the psychology or social aspect of it, and I would try to discuss it with my colleagues at my host institution or other students I knew from other institutions who are working on similar projects, I found that people's understanding is quite limited outside of their specific biological domain, and which is not a big problem if you consider other topics. But mental health and mental illness has a huge social angle, and especially in the research community in academia, there are so many existing surveys and so many existing statistics that say that researchers are highly prone to mental health related conditions, and that happens primarily due to the nature of research. The chances of failing at research, the chance, especially experimental research, is very high. And for a lot of people, the journey through PhD and as a researcher through life can be a pretty lonely one, because you can't. So, as a PhD student in a country like India, you are neither entirely a student or nor are you entirely an employee. You do get paid a stipend, if you're lucky. Some people don't get a stipend and are still doing PhD. That's also a reality. But most people who are doing a PhD get a stipend. But at the same time, you have certain responsibilities that are like that of a student. Like you have some credits to fulfill, you have regular submissions to do. But then you also don't have a classroom structure. It's not like you have to attend lectures with a bunch of other people that you share a camaraderie with. So it's a very unusual kind of situation. And it leads to a lot of instability because I'll be honest, the stipend is not amazing. The PhD stipend that you get in India and across the world, it's minimum. And if someone has to support family on that stipend, that is added pressure. So financial pressures are going to be there. Stressors, work stressors are going to be there if your experiments keep failing, or if theory or hypothesis you're working on keeps failing. Because to get the degree, to cross that bridge, you need to discover something new, something no one else has done so far. And that is not an easy feat, especially because in today's world where there are so many researchers across the world and so many people working on similar lines and similar angles, finding something that is uniquely yours can be a challenge. And so, considering all this, researchers are prone to uh, high rates of mental health conditions. There are a lot of surveys that have shown this. And despite this, I realized that the understanding of mental illnesses uh, is lacking, and there is a stigma associated with it. So, and this I'm talking from the institute that I did my PhD in is considered one of the really good biology research institutions in India. And for most purposes, it is good. It is a pretty good institution. The working environment is quite nice. The community is quite accepting. And even there, I noticed that there is a stigma against mental illness. And that to me was very jarring. So, towards this end, at some point during my PhD, I think sometime during my second year, I just started talking about this aspect of mental illness, not just the biology aspect, but the psychology and the sociology aspect of it. And it actually started with an informal talk that I gave in the institute, just among the students. It was some small event that the students used to do. And I just gave a very informal talk, and I spoke about how mental illnesses could be considered as part of a spectrum, and how the diagnosis of mental illnesses has evolved over time. It was a very general discussion, but it ended up going into the different kinds of mental illnesses, not just depression, but anxiety, OCD, several others. And we ended up having a very nice group discussion. Uh, I also touched upon aspects of therapy and the difference between psychology and psychiatry, things like that. And in general, like, it was well received. But about a week or 10 days after this talk, I remember a friend of mine from the institute, they came to me and they told me that following my discussion, they realized that they are going through things that they should seek professional help for. And following that, they actually started seeing a therapist and got help. And it was something they really needed to do. And they probably would have never done if not for that talk and that discussion. So that's when I realized that, talking about these things can have actual impact, can actually help people, if not everyone in the vicinity, at least one person. And even if one person gets benefited by me just talking about things I've read, things that I've gone through, then that for me would be like an accomplishment. So I guess that's how I sort of became a mental health advocate. And since then, I think I've taken almost every opportunity I've got to talk about mental illness, mental health, and the stigma, and why there should be no stigma, and why these conditions are real conditions with actual biological basis in the brain, and why it's required that we understand them and address them rather than pushing them under the carpet. So yes, that is a societal issue that I'm very passionate about. And last year, along with another neuroscientist friend of mine, I even started an Instagram page to raise awareness about mental health. And yeah, we're working on it. We're also taking inspiration from people like you and hoping to start a podcast on mental health at some point. That's also in the works. But yes, these are a few small things that I'm doing towards this cause.
Thank you so much. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I don't have any specific questions.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing time with us in the podcast. I really appreciate you spending time with us. I wish you all the best in your work as well as whatever you aspire to do in your life. Please take care and bye bye.
Thank you very much. Take care.
That was a great podcast with Annapoorna Premkumar. Please subscribe to this channel and follow it for more awesome podcasts. Opinions expressed by the guests in this podcast are their own. The host or the sponsors of the podcast do not condone the opinions expressed by the guests or the actions arising out of those opinions. Any decisions or actions that the listeners might take as a result of listening to this podcast must be based on their own judgment and will be at their own risk. The podcast host or their sponsors will not be held responsible for the consequences of any actions and or decisions taken as a result of any content in this podcast.